April 12, 1945. The last month of the European War was a landscape of fire and silence. Across Germany, cities once celebrated for their cathedrals, markets, and music now smoldered in endless ruins. In Cologne, the air smelled of wet ash, the skyline punctured by skeletal spires that rose from seas of rubble. In Dresden, mothers lined up for water with tin pails, passing the remains of their homes reduced to heaps of brick. And in Hamburg, children played in bomb craters, their laughter thin and strange against the memory of sirens that had howled night after night. For women caught in this wreckage, survival meant scavenging, queuing, and mourning. Many of them had once walked those streets with books under their arms or baskets full of bread. Now they carried nothing but fear, shame, and a soldier's hard ration if they were lucky enough to have it. Among them were women tied to the Wehrmacht, clerks, nurses, auxiliaries, and wives who had followed regiments across occupied Europe. Some had believed in the cause. Others had followed out of duty or desperation. By April, their uniforms were tattered, their loyalty frayed, and their sense of certainty shattered. As American forces pushed deeper into German soil, entire columns of displaced civilians surrendered, among them women who had no illusions left about the Reich's promises. They were herded into makeshift gathering points, their futures reduced to the single word written on lists and chalkboards: Gefangene, prisoners. The expectation was simple and terrifying. Propaganda had prepared them for cruelty. For years, the Reich had portrayed Americans as crude and merciless, mongrels, opportunists driven by vengeance. Around campfires and in bunkers, whispers circulated. Captured women would be paraded, mocked, left to starve, perhaps worse. The stories were meant to harden resolve, but by 1945 they deepened dread. Each mile they marched under foreign guard tightened that knot of fear. They hid their faces beneath scarves, ashamed of the dust on their skin, ashamed too of being conquered, of no longer belonging anywhere. The trains that carried them east toward the Rhine did not clatter with soldiers bound for the front, but rattled with women, children, and broken men. Through the cracks in the wooden cars, the women saw flashes of countryside greening with spring. Farmers tilled fields, smoke curled from cottages, and the world beyond the rails seemed oblivious to their despair. Some tried to memorize the images, fearing they would be the last they saw of home. Others closed their eyes, waiting for hunger to hollow them out as it already had so many in the bombed cities behind them. When they disembarked, American sentries waited, young men with rifles slung across their shoulders, faces hard from long campaigns. The women expected curses, maybe blows. Instead, they were directed in clipped English and gestures toward camp gates. Behind the wire stood neat rows of barracks, not the dark cages of their imagination, but wooden huts with roofs intact, windows patched, and kitchens that gave off the unfamiliar smell of coffee. Even that scent unsettled them. For years they had brewed ersatz, burnt barley or acorns pretending to be coffee. The real thing was almost a provocation. They averted their eyes, unwilling to believe it. Days blurred into routine. Names were recorded, possessions inventoried, assignments given. Some women were placed in laundry details, their hands red with soap and cold water. Others stitched uniforms or cooked under watchful eyes. At night they lay on bunks and whispered in disbelief that they had not yet been beaten or starved. Rations were meager by American standards, but astonishing by German ones. Bread that was not stretched with sawdust, potatoes without mold, even occasional meat. Some wept quietly, the shame of gratitude mixing with the memory of their own families who still starved in basements back home. But captivity carried its own weight. The wire was a constant reminder of their fall. Beyond it, the landscape seemed calm, untouched. Trees blossomed, rivers ran clear, villages stood whole. It was as though the war had never reached this place, and that contrast gnawed at them more than hunger or fear. They had marched out of rubble, and here stood order. They had lived beneath ceilings that collapsed in firestorms, and here lamps glowed behind curtains. Their defeat was not just military, it was personal, visible in every neat fence post and every street that still carried laughter. In the quiet hours, some women recalled what their cities had been. They spoke of Berlin's cafes, Munich's theaters, Cologne's bridges. The memories felt like ghost stories now, whispered to keep despair at bay. They compared those images to the American towns they glimpsed from the camp edges, places that seemed preserved in glass, unbroken by bombs. "Better than our cities," one muttered under her breath, though she dared not say it louder. The words felt like betrayal, yet the truth pressed against them all the same. Letters, when permitted, carried home a strange mixture of relief and guilt. One wrote of bread so white she thought it was cake. Another described children she saw playing baseball beyond the camp, their clothes unstained by soot. To relatives still digging potatoes out of frozen ground, these accounts seemed unreal. Some dismissed them as lies meant to break their spirits. Others clung to them as fragments of hope, proof that life could exist untouched by fire. The Americans, for their part, treated these women with a mix of practicality and detachment. Guards were often too young to carry hatred. Many looked at the prisoners with curiosity rather than contempt. Farmers who saw them assigned to work details spoke of their silence, their exhaustion, and their astonishment at simple things. Soap that lathered richly, water that flowed from pumps without waiting in line. To Americans, these details were ordinary. To the prisoners, they were revelations that unsettled their very sense of the world. And yet, beneath every observation ran the same undercurrent. Shame. Shame that they were captives. Shame that they relied on the mercy of those they had been taught to despise. Shame that their own nation, once so proud, lay in dust while their enemy's land seemed whole. That shame did not vanish with food or shelter. It lingered in their eyes, in the way they avoided mirrors, in the way they hesitated to touch the bread they were given, as though it might accuse them of weakness. The spring wore on, and the war drew to its close. News filtered into the camps, rumors of Hitler's bunker, of unconditional surrender, of a Reich that no longer existed. The women listened, numb. They were prisoners not only of America, but of history, caught between what had been promised and what now stood revealed. And when, at last, they were led from the wire toward their first assignments outside the camp, they carried all of that with them: fear, shame, memory, and a reluctant flicker of curiosity about what lay beyond the gates. The guards opened the way, and the women stepped into the sunlight. Ahead stretched the road toward an American town, intact, bustling, alive. The women tightened their scarves, bracing for hostility, for jeers, for some punishment yet to come. But what awaited them would be something far stranger and far more unsettling than any cruelty they had imagined. The first march into town was quiet, the kind of silence that grew from both fear and disbelief. The German women walked in rows, guarded by young American soldiers whose rifles hung casually at their sides. Their boots crunched gravel, their skirts and coats, threadbare from years of war, hung loose on bodies thinned by rationing. They expected stares of hatred, perhaps stones or insults hurled at them as they entered what they thought would be enemy streets. Instead, the only sound that greeted them was the murmur of traffic, the clatter of a shop door, and the laughter of children chasing one another across a green lawn. For the women, each sound was a jolt. It was not the sound of vengeance. It was the sound of life continuing, as though the war they had endured belonged to another world entirely. The town lay before them like something pulled from a memory they no longer trusted. Houses stood whole, with paint still bright, their porches adorned with rocking chairs and flower pots. Windows were unbroken, curtains neatly drawn, chimneys giving off the clean scent of wood smoke. There were no ruins, no blackened beams clawing at the sky, no cratered roads. Even the lampposts along the street gleamed as though polished. The women could hardly lift their eyes from the ground, but when they did, the sight pressed against their chests with an almost physical force. It was not just beauty, it was wholeness, and wholeness felt like a rebuke. At the town square, the real shock came. A grocery store sat on the corner, its wide glass windows displaying rows of goods. The guards, indifferent, allowed the women to pause as their American escorts stepped inside. Through the glass, they saw shelves heavy with canned fruit, jars of jam and loaves of bread wrapped in waxed paper. A woman behind the counter smiled at a customer and weighed sugar on a scale as though it were nothing. Sugar, in quantities the German women had not seen since their girlhood. One leaned forward, her face pale, and whispered, "This cannot be real." Another, only 23 but with the eyes of someone much older, pressed her lips together to keep from crying. In Hamburg, her sister had died searching for potatoes in the rubble. Here, sugar was measured in scoops. Across the street, a diner buzzed with chatter, plates clattering as waitresses refilled cups of coffee that steamed in the morning light. The prisoners slowed their steps, unable to keep their curiosity from breaking through the shell of fear. This abundance, so casual to the Americans, struck them like a wound. One woman recalled the years she had fed her children watery soup of turnips and rye husks. Another thought of the queues that had stretched for blocks in Berlin, only to end with empty baskets and hollow faces. Here, there were no queues. There was choice. There was plenty. An older woman among them, her hair streaked with gray, though she was only 35, muttered, "This is better than our cities." The words slipped out before she could stop them. A guard turned his head, but he did not seem to understand. The women beside her, however, stiffened at the truth of it. Better than their cities. The phrase was treasonous to everything they had been taught, and yet it echoed the thought forming in each of their minds. Their cities had been cultural capitals, once shining with theaters, operas, and universities. Now they were heaps of ash. And here, in an enemy town, stood order, abundance, and laughter. The comparison was unbearable. The conflict within them deepened as they were taken to their work sites. Some were assigned to farms where they saw barns lit by electric bulbs. The glow itself was shocking. In Germany, the power grid had been crippled by bombings, and candles or kerosene lamps were luxuries. Others were placed in laundries or kitchens. One woman, no older than 20, carried baskets of linens through a house where children sprawled on clean rugs, playing with toys. She froze at the sight of a refrigerator humming in the corner, its door opened by a housewife who casually placed a carton of milk inside. Cold milk in springtime. At home, milk was a memory. Here, it was routine. Everywhere they turned, they encountered the same bewildering contrast: food, fuel, intact houses, and streets safe enough for children to run barefoot. And everywhere, too, they felt a piercing shame. They had been told they were the chosen people of a 1,000-year Reich. Yet the Reich lay in ruins, its people scavenging for crusts, while the enemy's ordinary life surpassed even their best memories of home. The realization gnawed at them, leaving them unsteady, unable to decide whether to envy or resent what they saw. The townspeople, for their part, were cautious but rarely cruel. Some avoided the prisoners altogether, unwilling to look at the women who had once been part of the enemy. Others watched them with curiosity, whispering behind hands. But a few offered small gestures, a cup of water, a kind word, even a slice of bread pressed into a work-worn hand. The prisoners did not know how to receive such kindness. Some recoiled, suspecting a trick. Others accepted, trembling, unable to hold back tears. It was not cruelty that disarmed them. It was generosity. That night back at the camp, the women whispered about what they had seen. They spoke of oranges stacked in pyramids at a market stall, their skins so bright they seemed painted. They spoke of the children with shoes that still fit, of porches with rocking chairs untouched by shrapnel, of pies cooling on windowsills. They tried to make sense of it and failed. Perhaps it is only this town, one suggested, but others shook their heads. The abundance was too casual, too woven into every corner. It could not be an illusion. America was not starving. America was thriving. And that truth unsettled them more than any prison fence. When sleep came, it brought no rest. Their dreams replayed the images of the day: bread warm from the oven, sausages in the shop window, children running through streets unscarred by bombs. The women turned on their bunks, each carrying the same heavy realization. The war had promised them greatness, but here, in the enemy's towns, they saw a greatness of another kind. It was a greatness measured not in victories or flags, but in ordinary abundance, in peace so tangible it seemed unreal. The next morning, as they prepared again for work details, the guards opened the gates. The women stepped into the sunlight, their eyes catching once more the intact roofs of the town ahead. They braced themselves, but not for cruelty. This time, they braced for the sight that unsettled them most of all: a world where the enemy lived better than they had ever known, a truth they could neither deny nor fully endure. The work details began quietly, with little more than nods from the Americans, and murmured instructions through interpreters. The German women moved stiffly at first, unsure how to behave in a world that had turned upside down. They had expected cruelty, yet found themselves folding laundry beside American housewives, peeling potatoes in church basements, or tending fields under the spring sun, while farmers gave them water from clean tin cups. Every gesture seemed too ordinary to trust, and that very ordinariness became the most disorienting thing of all. One morning, a group of women were assigned to help in a church kitchen. The building smelled of polish and hymnals, its wooden pews gleaming in the light. They were given aprons and directed to chop vegetables. The task was familiar, but what awaited them at midday was not. Platters of roasted turkey, bowls of steaming potatoes, and baskets of soft rolls were set on long tables for a community meal. The prisoners froze, their hands hovering above the food, unable to believe it was meant for them too. One housewife gently pushed a plate into a young woman's hands. The girl trembled, then took a bite of bread so soft it seemed to melt. Her eyes filled with tears before she could hide them. She whispered in German, "This is impossible." The women around her nodded, too stunned to speak. On another day, a farm detail led them to an orchard. They gathered fallen apples there, fingers brushing dust from skins that were still red and crisp. The farmer, an older man with sun-creased eyes, watched them work. At the break, he handed them fresh cider in glass jars, the liquid cool and sweet. They drank cautiously at first, then with a desperate thirst, the taste unlike anything they had known since before the war. One woman thought of her children scavenging shriveled beets back in Bremen, and the contrast nearly broke her. She turned away so the guards would not see her weep. The moments of astonishment multiplied. A woman of 22, gaunt from years of rations, was given her first glass of iced tea in Kansas. She stared at the clinking cubes, the condensation dripping down the glass as though it were alchemy. She touched it with her fingertips before daring a sip. The shock of sweetness nearly made her laugh, though the laugh caught in her throat. Another woman, placed in a laundry, found herself marveling at soap that produced thick, fragrant suds. At home, she had scrubbed with gray blocks that barely foamed. Here, the scent of lavender filled the air, clinging to her hands long after the work was done. It was humiliating to feel gratitude for soap, yet she could not deny the relief it gave her. The Americans seemed not to notice the depth of their prisoners' astonishment. For them, these things were normal. Housewives chatted while hanging, laundry, unconcerned that the women beside them had once worn the eagle and swastika on their sleeves. Farmers spoke in plain tones, giving instructions about crops as though explaining them to neighbors rather than enemies. Even the guards grew less rigid, watching the women with curiosity more than suspicion. Some offered them cigarettes, others joked in broken German, testing out words they had picked up. The prisoners responded cautiously, wary of showing too much humanity, yet each encounter chipped away at the wall of fear they carried. Letters, when permitted, became confessions of disbelief. A woman wrote to her mother in Hanover about the bread she had eaten, bread white as clouds, so unlike the dark loaves mixed with barley husks that Germans had known for years. Another described the sight of children in clean clothes, shoes without holes, running across fields without ducking at the sound of planes. The mothers who received these letters scarcely knew whether to trust them. Some thought they were fabrications, tricks of propaganda. Others held them as evidence that perhaps beyond the rubble, life could still exist. Yet the prisoners themselves wrestled with the meaning of it all. To admit that America's ordinary abundance surpassed everything they had been promised was to admit betrayal at the deepest level. They had been told they belonged to the most advanced nation on earth. Yet here they were, peeling potatoes in kitchens where butter and cream were used without measure, where coffee was poured freely, where families owned radios and cars that seemed untouched by scarcity. The contrast gnawed at them, not only because it made them envious, but because it revealed the hollowness of the Reich's promises. Their own leaders had boasted of superiority, yet their people starved while the enemy dined in plenty. Not all encounters were warm. Some Americans looked at the prisoners with cold eyes, refusing to speak, their silence heavy with judgment. One woman remembered how a housewife deliberately placed her plate last, letting her feel the weight of her outsider's shame. Yet even these slights were gentler than the punishments they had feared. Cruelty would have been easier to accept. Kindness, however hesitant, was unbearable. It made them question everything. The conflict grew sharper within them. One night in the barracks, a woman admitted she had been given a jar of strawberry preserves. She had tasted one spoonful and nearly fainted at the memory it stirred. Summer mornings before the war, when her mother spread jam on fresh rolls. She passed the jar around, each woman dipping a finger, tasting not only fruit but the echo of a life they thought gone forever. The barrack fell silent afterward. The sweetness carried both joy and torment, because it reminded them how far they had fallen. Some Americans, noticing their hesitation, pressed further kindness. A farmer's wife once slipped a scarf into a prisoner's hands, whispering that the Kansas winters would be cold. The woman took it, stunned by the gift, then spent the night turning it over in her hands as though it were contraband. Was it kindness or pity? Either way, it branded her heart. Over time, these human encounters reshaped the women more than fences or guards ever could. The war had stripped them of illusions, but what they saw in America forced them to confront something harder. The enemy was not only stronger in arms, but stronger in ordinary life. Peace here was not a dream, it was reality. And that reality was better than anything they had known. It was a truth that unsettled them, because it meant their suffering had not been inevitable, only the product of choices made by leaders who had promised greatness and delivered ruin. As spring deepened, the women moved through towns with less fear, but with no less wonder. They worked, they ate, they listened, they watched. They whispered to one another the phrase they dared not say aloud before, "Better than our cities." The words had become undeniable, and yet the more they repeated them, the heavier they felt, because they knew what it meant. It meant admitting not only defeat, but deception, that everything they had been taught about the enemy was wrong. That realization was as terrifying as hunger, and as irreversible as war. One evening, as they walked back to the camp, the sun dipped low behind the town. Lights flickered on in the windows, warm and steady. The women slowed, watching children gather at supper tables, hearing laughter drift across the streets. The guards urged them onward, but the image stayed. A young prisoner whispered, "They live as though there was never a war." Her voice broke, carrying both awe and despair. No one answered. They all knew the truth she had spoken, and tomorrow they would face it again more deeply than ever, in ways that would change them forever. By late summer of 1945, the women had grown accustomed to the rhythms of captivity, but not to the feelings it stirred. Each day they left the gates in silence, marched into towns or farms, and returned carrying baskets of laundry or crates of food scraps, their eyes full of sights they could not shake. The conflict was no longer just survival. It was comparison, relentless and painful. Their memories of Germany, cities in ruins, families scraping for rations, pressed against the reality of American life that unfolded in front of them. The contrast had become unbearable precisely because it was ordinary. For one woman, the turning point came in the kitchen of a modest home where she had been sent to help with canning. She stood at the table, slicing peaches that glowed golden in the afternoon light. The housewife hummed while sealing jars, her children tugging at her skirt, laughing, carefree. The German woman's hands trembled as she lifted a slice of fruit to her lips, the sweetness overwhelming. In that moment she saw not just food, but what it meant. Stability, continuity, a future that did not hinge on air raid sirens. She swallowed hard and realized she was tasting not merely a peach, but the difference between a life shattered and a life sustained. She looked at the housewife with a mixture of envy and sorrow, wondering how the enemy had secured peace while her own nation had chosen destruction. Others felt it in quieter ways. One evening, walking back to the camp, they heard the faint hum of radios playing dance music through open windows. The melody drifted across streets that had never known bombs. To them, music had become a memory of sirens cutting it short, of dance halls collapsing into fire. Here the music played on without interruption, a soundtrack to meals, laughter, and youth. One prisoner whispered, "Do you hear it?" They are not afraid of the night. The others nodded silently, each imagining how fear had become the permanent backdrop of their own lives, while here it was absent, unthinkable. The absence of fear itself was the luxury they could hardly comprehend. The conflict grew sharper when they remembered the promises of the Reich. They had been told Germany would lead the world, that sacrifice would secure glory, that hardship was a noble burden. Yet glory had collapsed into rubble, and here in America, without the trumpet of ideology, families lived better than emperors. This realization struck at the core of their identity. If the enemy lived in abundance and their own nation lay in ashes, then what had all the suffering been for? The shame was corrosive, but it carried with it a strange kind of liberation. They began to see with painful clarity that power built on cruelty was weaker than peace built on plenty. There were moments when they dared to voice their thoughts aloud. In the barracks after long days, conversations circled around the same refrain, better than our cities. They said it now without irony, though always in hushed tones. One woman admitted she had stopped dreaming of Berlin's theaters, and instead dreamed of an American grocery aisle. Another confessed she had envied the children's laughter more than the food. These confessions were not just about envy. They were about loss, about the realization that their own nation's future had been stolen by its leaders, leaving them to marvel at what could have been. They were learning that the war had not only destroyed buildings, but had also robbed them of the possibility of ordinary happiness. The Americans, often unaware of the depth of this conflict, continued to treat them with a mix of practicality and distant kindness. Guards handed out cigarettes without much thought. Farmers gave them work and water, sometimes even pie. Housewives occasionally pressed food into their hands, whispering, "Don't tell anyone." To the women, these small gestures carried weight beyond measure. Kindness was harder to process than cruelty because it required them to see the enemy not as monsters, but as human beings who lived differently, perhaps even better, than they had ever imagined. Each act of kindness became another crack in the wall of propaganda that had shaped their lives. For some, the revelation deepened into reflection. They began to wonder how a society could produce such abundance, how families could eat so well, while their own people starved. They noticed how men and women spoke to each other with less formality, how children were indulged rather than hardened, how communities seemed to thrive without constant displays of discipline and order. It was not just material wealth they saw. It was a culture that valued comfort, laughter, and stability as much as victory. In that realization lay the heart of the contrast. Germany had pursued power, while America had pursued prosperity, and prosperity had proven the stronger shield. The irony was bitter. In the final weeks of the war, when Hitler ranted of final victories, German women were queuing for horsemeat and shivering in basements. At that same moment, across the ocean, American women were filling baskets with oranges, planning picnics, and hanging fresh laundry on lines that had never been dusted with ash. This irony, once glimpsed, could not be unseen. It became the wound they carried, deeper than hunger or captivity. It was the knowledge that they had been deceived, that their loyalty had been spent on ruins, while their enemies' loyalty had built homes that endured. And yet, in that wound, something shifted. For many, the shock of seeing a different way of life planted a seed of possibility. Perhaps the world did not need to be endless sacrifice and discipline. Perhaps life could mean more than survival under a collapsing roof. Some began to imagine what it would mean to live without fear, to walk a street where music played at night, to eat bread without measuring every crumb. These thoughts were fragile, but they took root, whispering of futures beyond rubble. The lesson was not spoken in proclamations, but in whispers and glances. It was in the way a woman savored a peach slice, the way another listened to music drifting from a window, the way they watched children laugh without ducking at the sound of planes. Each small moment built toward the same unspoken truth. Peace, not conquest, had produced the life they now envied. It was a truth that could not be shouted in the camp, but it lingered in every heart. As the war's end was declared and surrender became fact, the women knew they would one day leave these fences. They did not know if they would return to ruins or to families still alive, but they knew they would carry with them the memory of what they had seen. It was not tanks or guns that haunted them most. It was the sight of ordinary American towns, alive with light, laughter, and plenty. And in that memory lay a judgment sharper than any court could give. The Reich had promised them greatness, but the enemy had shown them what greatness truly looked like. On their final evening before transfer, they stood by the wire, watching the lights of the town flicker on as the sun set. The glow was steady, unbroken, a beacon of a life untouched by war. One woman whispered, "If only our children had known such nights." The others remained silent, but the weight of her words hung heavy. Tomorrow they would be taken away, back toward the uncertainty of a broken homeland. But the images of America, the bread, the music, the laughter, would follow them. Impossible to forget, impossible to reconcile.